Welcome to Cameron United Methodist Church Zoom Worship, August 2nd, 2020, Seeking the Sacred in the Struggle. Following is a reading from the Ancient Wisdom and the homily offered by Reverend Dr. Valerie L. Jackson. For details of Cameron Worship, please visit our webpage at www.cameronchurch.org.
This morning's ancient wisdom comes from the book of Genesis, the 32nd chapter. Jacob wrestles with God. That night, Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, his 11 sons, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. After he had sent them across the stream, he sent over all his possessions. So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him till daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. Then the man said,
"Let me go, for it is daybreak."
But Jacob replied,
"I will not let you go unless you bless me."
The man asked him,
"What is your name?"
"Jacob."
He answered. Then the man said,
"Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome."
Jacob said,
"Please, tell me your name."
but he replied,
"Why do you ask my name?"
Then he blessed him there. So Jacob called the place,
Peniel.
saying,
It is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared.
Good morning again, Cameron. For all who are visiting with us this morning, I am Reverend Dr. Valerie L. Jackson, and it is my sincere honor to be the lead pastor of this wonderful faith community, whom I am affectionately known as Pastor Jackson or PJ. In addition to the dedication that you heard Charlie share with us earlier, I also want to dedicate this message and this worship to our own Reverend Dr. John Lee. This biblical story of how and when Jacob became Israel is one of the most popular stories in Christian history. It is a story of divine mystery, a story of an encounter between the sacred and humanity. It is a story of perseverance, a story of survival and victory, a story of transformation and divine prophecy. For this is a story announcing the coming of a new person, a new nation, a new world. And finally, this is a story that brings us face to face with the notion of struggling, wrestling, the struggle that takes us from and through darkness to light, the struggle and the wrestle that shows us, reveals to us a different, better, and higher version of who we are. This is a story that epitomizes the question put before us by Dr. Lee: what are we being called to become because of this, that we could not become without it? Struggle is present from the origin of all creation. It was present at the beginning and is described in ancient wisdom in this way: The earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. Struggle was most likely present when each and every one of us logistically came into this world. It was a wrestle between where we had been for a period of time, typically 9 months, the only place that we had known at that time, and the place where we were aiming to go. We pushed our way through the threshold of life from the innermost parts of our moms. We announced our arrival time by initiating a struggle that is recognized as pain. And so the journey to newness began. We were welcomed and received into the world because all involved in the birthing of us embraced and leaned into the struggle of pain to help this historical moment happen. On the one hand, this is quite interesting and ironic to me because I find that many of us avoid struggle and wrestling at all costs sometimes, even though it has been natural to our existence from the beginning. We avoid the hard but needed conversations with our children. We avoid the hard but needed conversations with our spouses, our partners, and our family members. I don't know about you, but I know in my family there are many conversations that have not yet happened because we all avoid to have them. We avoid the hard but needed conversations about race, gender differences, and gender identities. We avoid talking about sex, so much so that sometimes couples marry and have no idea the sacredness of intimacy and sex. We avoid talking about rape and molestation. We avoid talking about domestic violence, human trafficking, finances, wealth, and poverty. We avoid talking about mental and emotional wellness and unwellness, even when we sense that we may be standing in the tension of wellness and unwellness. We will avoid recognizing it or naming it and giving voice to it to take action. We avoid growing older, sickness and disease. We avoid talking about death and dying. Cameron, I invite you now, if there are any other areas of our lives that you feel we avoid discussing because we want to avoid the struggle, I invite you to add them in the chat box now. On the other hand, some of us may avoid struggle and wrestling whenever possible because we have come to know that struggles will simply find us whether we want to be found or not. We have struggles simply with growing up, especially during our adolescence years. During our time, during my time, we struggled with things like acne, belonging, popularity, feeling alone. Young people still are struggling with many things during adolescence. In fact, if you have not watched it yet, take the time to see if you can, the 13 Reasons Why, to see all that is involved in the lives of adolescents. We even struggle in our middle ages and beyond when our bodies begin to change. When we come to realize that there is more life behind us than before us. We struggle with dysfunctional parents and families. We struggle with aging parents. We struggle to find people who genuinely like us and have our backs. And depending on the economy, we struggle with finding jobs or finding jobs that will adequately provide for us financially or with benefits and insurance. We certainly struggle to find jobs that make us happy, that are life-giving and life-affirming. There was once a study that said that Monday mornings at 8:00 a.m. was the most prevalent time for heart attacks, because this was the time for people to return to work after the weekends. We also struggle with knowing when it is time to move on from one job to something new. And because we struggle with a dysfunctional nation, many struggle simply by virtue of being born. Some of us struggle with being born into poverty, being born with Black and brown bodies, being born with different abilities and inabilities, being born a woman or being born LGBTQIA, or also being born into bodies and gender identities that we do not connect or identify with. As the young people would say, my friends, the struggle is real. And in the words of Nicholas Sparks, when you're struggling with something, look at all the people around you and realize that every single person you see is struggling with something. And to them, it's just as hard as what you are going through. Yes, the struggle is real, and sometimes the struggles of life find us whether we want to be found or not. And such was the case for Jacob in this story. He did not appear to be given the privilege of avoiding this particular struggle. And if you remember, Jacob entered this world in a struggle, holding on to the heel of his twin brother. He was not given the privilege to avoid this struggle with the man that just showed up, and the struggle began. Whether or not this struggle was with a man or the presence of God is uncertain according to ancient wisdom, but it is important to note here that that distinction did not seem to be important to Jacob, because whether human or divine, Jacob simply decided to seek the sacred in the struggle. He sought to be blessed by the struggle. He leaned into it. He embraced the struggle. He even dared to ask and demand something of the sacred in this struggle, which is a tremendous act of faith. So I wonder, my Cameron friends, during tough times, have we ever proactively considered the possibility of seeking the sacred within the struggle, no matter what that struggle might be? I wonder what may be possible if we could manage to believe that in the midst, somewhere, even if unseen, even if unfelt, that the sacred is at work in our struggles or at work within us. Or I wonder what may be possible if we were to consider the possibility that it is actually the sacred who is wrestling with us, that divine source of life, that creative force that formed us in the image of the divine, the sacred wrestling with us, pushing and giving birth to a higher form of who we are. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross the one who gives us the 5 stages of grief, suggests that the most beautiful people we have known are those who have known defeat, known suffering, known struggle, known loss, and have found their way out of the depths. These persons have an appreciation, a sensitivity, and an understanding of life that fills them with compassion, gentleness, and a deep, loving concern. Beautiful people, she says, don't just happen. So could it be, my Cameron friends, that amid struggle, it is the perfect time for us to raise the question again posed by our beloved John Lee? What are we being called to become because of this that we could not become without it? Now let us be very clear. If you are currently enduring struggle that is abusive or life-threatening, seek now to find your way out. Or if you know of anyone in abusive or life-threatening struggles, do what you can to help them find their way out immediately. Right now, though, in the midst of COVID-19, in the midst of Black Lives Matter, in the midst of immigration oppressions, in the midst of perpetually dishonoring Native Americans, in the midst of a very frightening time in our nation, in the midst of losing angels such as John Lewis and John Lee, individually and collectively, what are we being called to overcome? What are we being called to become? Because as you become, and as I become, as we become, the community will also become. The nation will also become, and so will the world. It is and will be a ripple effect. So let us, with intentionality and faith, remove ourselves from the peripherals of life and seek the sacred in the struggle.